Margarita Engle. My mother's from Cuba and my father was from Los Angeles. He traveled to Cuba when he was young and as an artist to paint her town, Trinidad, which he had seen in a National Geographic magazine. And he decided he wanted to paint the colonial architecture. And on his first day there, they met at an art school, which it was in a colonial palace. And they fell in love at first sight, but they didn't speak the same language. He only spoke English and she only spoke Spanish. But they were artists, so they drew pictures and passed them back and forth to get to know each other. And that palace is now known as El Museo Romantico, the Romantic Museum, not because they met there, but because it's now a museum of Romantic era art. Mm-hmm. But I always, growing up, was fascinated by her town. I grew up in his town, Los Angeles, and was only able to visit her family in some of the summers, not every summer, but some of the summers. But those were really important summers to me. They were my chance to learn Cuban culture and to learn about my extended family, her extended family. Growing up in California, she was still learning English when I was little. So she would recite poetry to me in Spanish, José Martí, los versos sencillos, simple verses. And then as she learned English, she started reading picture books to me and my sister in English. And then she became a big advocate of the library and took us to the library all the time. Mm-hmm. By the time I was 5 or 6, I was inventing my own poems in my mind without writing them down usually. Sometimes I wrote them down, but as I walked to and from school, sort of to the rhythm of my footsteps, I was always composing poetry. I have no musical talents, but poetry for me was a rhythmic musical language, and it still is. And it makes me happy. People always ask, why do you write? Actually, a lot of people ask this question. Mm-hmm. Why do you write verse novels instead of the regular way? Mm-hmm. And my answer used to be very complicated, and now it's simple. I just realized that the poetry makes me happy. The musical language helps soften the blow of any difficult story that I might tell, both for me and hopefully for the reader too.
Mm. It seems like, do you feel like that poetry also kind of, it seems like it connects a little more emotionally? I feel
I hope so. I hope so. What I've tried to do all along, whether they're historical novels or with my own verse memoirs, is focus on the emotions. Mm-hmm. And for this reason, even when it's very detailed historical information, I do sacrifice some detail in order to distill these complex situations down to the basic emotions. And I write in first person and in present tense. Some of the picture books are in past tense, picture book biographies, but the verse novels and verse memoirs are all present tense, which makes no sense for a memoir to be in present tense because obviously it's things that happened a long time ago. But that's my way of inviting the reader to time travel and experience it as if they're inside my mind. And I feel like the open spaces in verse books are not empty spaces, they're open spaces. They contain the poet's emotions and they contain the reader's emotions. So I feel like we can, by leaving those open spaces, by not filling in every single detail, we can meet in that open space emotionally in midair and communicate. And because poetry is so emotional, I hope that teachers and adults reading to children or reading poetry with children and teenagers will ask them, how did the poem make you feel? Instead of asking them, what does the poem mean? I think that the pressure to interpret that second question, what does a poem mean?
Right.
You know, unless you're a graduate student majoring in poetry, that question can be intimidating and can trigger a fear of poetry that might be lifelong, where they think, oh, poetry's hard. It's hard to interpret. There's only one right answer. None of that's true. There isn't only one right answer. There's so many different ways to react to a poem depending on one's own background and mood on that particular day. Depending on your surroundings, whether you're, indoors in a crowded place or outdoors in nature, you might interpret the poem differently. So I really think, how did the poem make you feel is a much better question than what does the poem mean? And I hope everybody rewrites the SAT in accordance with that philosophy.
That would be great if they would. And how do you go about choosing your subjects? Like some of them, I know you write a lot about forgotten figures in history, especially Cuban history. I have here like a few like Dancing Hands, and of course, Drum Dream Girl, which is one of your most well-known books. How do you decide? How did you find out about them? These people that most of us have never heard of, and then how do you decide which ones you want to write about?
I find out about them by being just an insatiable reader, just constantly reading. And sometimes I'll come across something that's so fascinating, like those two musicians. Both of them to me are fascinating. And I wonder, why didn't I already know this? Why didn't I learn it in school? And if I didn't learn it in school, then, maybe other children could, or at the library. And so my ideas come sometimes from reading. Of course, many come from experience too. Now, the historical novels require a great deal of research, but one like this, Your Heart, My Sky, this first novel set in the 90s, inspired by the time of terrible hunger in Cuba, which is recurring again now, when the economy, in the 90s, it was the economy had collapsed after Russia withdrew its subsidies after the Soviet Union collapsed. And the hunger was something that I saw while visiting relatives, and that's different than experiencing it. And yet it was still a very personal story for me. And so, like my memoirs, Enchanted Air and Soaring Earth, it was based on experience rather than research. And in some ways, that's a much harder book to write, because if any of the memories are painful, then I have to face those. Now, it's much harder to face than, as difficult as history may be to face through research. The personal memories may require a different kind of strength that I have to somehow find. And again, the musical nature of poetry helps me to find that. Now, my next verse novel, Wings in the Wild, which comes out in April, is very much a STEM story. It's a love story, but it's also a STEM story. And it's about Cuba, and it's about Costa Rica. It's about the persecution of artists in Cuba, and it's about their escape and the way they walk from South America to the United States border. This one is set in 2018 when the border of Nicaragua closed to the walkers from Cuba. and tens of thousands were then stranded in refugee camps in Costa Rica. And so because Costa Rica is such a global example for rewilding and protecting natural areas, this story is about rewilding, protecting the rainforest, replanting the endangered species of plant, and by replanting endangered species of plant, providing the habitat needed by endangered species of animals. In this case, I really focused on macaws. It is a love story between humans, but macaws also fall in love. They have a lifespan around 80 years, and they mate for life. And so to cage them and put them in the pet trade separate from each other is incredibly cruel, as well as one of the things that contributes to their endangered status. But just by planting a particular species of tree to provide food for them, there are these amazing breeding programs that are helping to reestablish their habitat. There is a magical guitar in this story, and there was a magical dog in Your Heart, My Sky. So I've been really trying with my newer books to combine love stories with science, because I am by training a botanist and agronomist, and I want to write about the environmental challenges that we face and the hopeful steps that young people take towards choosing one small part of those environmental challenges and making a difference.
You've talked about how you love to write about young people who made hopeful choices in situations that seemed hopeless. And even if they're reading, even if it's a book about the past, that you're hoping to inspire young readers today as they're making their own decisions in what can often be difficult times. What do you hope that people take away from reading your books, especially the young readers?
Well, I always choose stories where I see the potential for a hopeful ending, whether they're true stories or fictionalized. I won't write it if I don't see the potential for a hopeful ending. I feel like I owe that to readers, to seek hope. But if there's one thing that I hope that my body of work as a whole communicates, if you look at all, you mentioned a wide variety of subjects, that's true. But if you look at all of them together and find one uniting factor, I hope that the legacy left by my books, if there is one, would be one that honors peacemakers.
I say that.
I feel like the people I've chosen to write about, historical figures and fictional characters, are always seeking a peacemaking way out of these complicated situations, rather than, I know that so much of children and teenagers entertainment is based on kind of a warrior thing.
Right.
And especially as we try to rediscover women's history, warriors are kind of idealized in TV and video games and all of this. And I just won't go there. I think that no matter what the situation is, we need to look to the future through peaceful means.
That's beautiful. And I would say another thread that goes through many of your books is about exploring Cuban heritage, or the idea of blending cultures. I mean, as I've shown before, you have a lot that are specifically focused on figures from or about times in
Yes.
Cuban history. And as you said, you know, you kind of grew up between two different cultures. Why do you think it was so important to connect with your mother's roots, or what would you say to children who might be growing up in a similar situation, that maybe either through immigration or maybe they have a family that blends cultures, why it's so important to connect with your heritage and honor that heritage and learn more about it?
Well, for me, there was a big before and after in my childhood, and that is that before the Bay of Pigs invasion and the missile crisis,
Mm,
my family was free to travel back and forth as often as we could afford to. Now, many times, people, even within the same country, you can't see your relatives as
right.
often as you might want to, simply because you can't afford to travel constantly. But after those historical events, travel was actually prohibited. My passport stated not valid for travel to Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea. You know, it specified countries that you could not travel to. And that didn't change until quite recently, although beginning in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, um, travel restrictions began to ease. They're still not normalized,
Mm-hmm.
but they began to ease in 1991, and then began to normalize under President Obama, but were reversed then afterwards. So for me, my teenage years in particular, it was easier for a US citizen to walk on the moon than to visit a grandmother in Cuba.
Mm,
And I think that now, you mentioned children with immigration, there are so many things that prevent kids from seeing their relatives and adults. It can be from, you know, dreamers, for instance, can't just go back and forth. They can't get back in if they leave.
right.
But there can be so many situations. There can be a dangerous situation. You know, people are leaving Venezuela and some of the other countries, Honduras,
Mm-hmm.
to flee violence and hunger. And you just can't go back
Right.
easily and be guaranteed being able to leave again, or be guaranteed being able to enter the United States again. So, and then there's the, um, it's so complicated. There's so many reasons that might separate families. And this is, again, why I want to emphasize peacemaking.
Mm,
Because whenever you don't have peace, it's real families that are affected.
right.
It's easy to just think of it as countries. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
this country's mad at that country.
Right.
But it's families, it's people. And we've seen that so clearly with the televised events in the Ukraine, you know,
Right.
where you see it happening, families being separated. So I just want to honor peacemakers.
Mm,
In the case of my most recent historical novel, Rima's Rebellion, I wrote about suffragists in Cuba in the 1920s and 30s because they have a unique story to tell.
mm-hmm.
And each country has a unique story of how women gained the right to vote. But people in the US tend to think, when we think of suffragists and when we look at what's available in terms of the history of women's voting rights struggles, the only books you usually find relate to the US and maybe a little bit to England, when actually each of the hundreds of countries in the world has had their own separate struggle at a different time, some of them very recent. And the only way that women could ever, in any of those countries, get the right to vote was to convince men to grant the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you don't have the right to vote, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to take it.
Right.
It has to be granted. And so in Cuba, they had voting clubs where women would practice just in case they ever got the right to vote. And there were complicated situations between upper class and lower class women, between rich women and poor. And one of the things they were struggling for was education for the poor children also. Mm-hmm. So all of these things were tied together, and there was a struggle against a dictatorship at the same time. Mm-hmm. There were so many things going on at the same time. In the 1920s and 30s, my mother was born in 1930, so she was actually born before women got the right to vote. She's still alive now. And it just makes you realize how recent some of these things were in terms of the long view of history.
Right. Well, and thank you for all of your books, because you're really helping bring these stories to light. Like you said, there are not many books about it here in the U.S. And for that, and for all of the books that you write, I was just looking at the time, so I'm going to wrap up because I'm going to be respectful of your time. And I know I said it was only going to be 20 minutes. So thank you for all that you're doing to bring these stories to light and to share them and to inspire young people today.